The rain came down hard that Tuesday afternoon, turning the streets into rivers of gray water. 12-year-old David pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, but it didn't help much. The jacket had 3 holes in it and the zipper had been broken for months. His sneakers were so worn out that he could feel every puddle he stepped in, the cold water seeping through the cardboard he'd stuffed inside to cover the holes in the soles. David's mother worked at the laundromat 2 blocks from their tiny apartment. She'd been there since 6 that morning, and she wouldn't be done until 10 at night. Someone had called in sick, so she'd taken a double shift. They needed the money. They always needed the money. The apartment above the Chinese restaurant was so small that David could touch both walls if he stretched out his arms in the bedroom. But it was home, and his mother worked herself to exhaustion to keep it. David didn't complain. He never complained. He knew how hard she tried, but today, he couldn't go home to that empty apartment. Not yet. The loneliness felt too heavy and the rain made everything worse, so he kept walking, his feet carrying him toward the nice part of town where the buildings were tall and clean, and people wore coats that actually kept out the rain. That's when he saw it. The Grandview Hotel. He'd passed by this building 100 times before, always on the other side of the street, always keeping his distance. It was the kind of place where doormen wore white gloves and women carried tiny dogs in expensive purses. The kind of place where someone like David didn't belong. But the rain was really coming down now and the wind was picking up. David looked at the hotel's glass doors, watching well-dressed people walk in and out shaking off their umbrellas. Nobody was going to care if he stood in the lobby for a few minutes just until the worst of the storm passed. Right? He pushed through the revolving door and suddenly he was in a different world. The lobby was massive with marble floors so shiny that David could see his reflection in them. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, bigger than his entire bedroom. Soft music played from hidden speakers and the air smelled like expensive perfume and fresh flowers. Groups of people sat in velvet chairs, drinking tea from delicate cups and speaking in low, cultured voices. David stayed close to the wall, trying to make himself invisible. Water dripped from his clothes onto the perfect floor, forming a small puddle around his feet. He should leave. He knew he should leave. But then he saw it, and his breath caught in his throat. In the center of the lobby, beneath that enormous chandelier, sat the most beautiful piano David had ever seen. It was a grand piano, black and glossy, reflecting the light from above like a pool of still water. The lid was propped open, revealing the strings inside. Just looking at it made David's heart race. He'd been teaching himself to play for 3 years now. It started when he found an old electronic keyboard in the dumpster behind the electronics store. Half the keys didn't work and it only had one working speaker, but David didn't care. He'd watched hundreds of videos on his phone, teaching himself notes and chords and scales. His phone screen was cracked in 3 places, and sometimes he had to watch the same video 10 times because it kept freezing, but he didn't give up. Music was the only thing that made sense to David. When he played, even on that broken keyboard with its missing keys and stuttering sound, he felt like he could breathe, like he was more than just a poor kid in a too small apartment, like he mattered. But this piano in front of him now wasn't anything like his keyboard. This was a real instrument, a Steinway, according to the gold letters on the side. David didn't know much about piano brands, but even he had heard of Steinway. This piano probably cost more than his mother made in 10 years. He took a step closer, drawn to it like a magnet. Then another step. The lobby was quiet. Most of the guests focused on their conversations and their tea. Nobody was paying attention to one wet kid. David's hands were shaking as he reached out and touched the smooth wood of the piano's side. It was cool beneath his fingers, solid and real. He walked around to the bench and just stood there for a moment staring at the keys. 88 perfect ivory keys, not a single one broken or stuck or silent. What would it sound like? A real piano, a good piano played by someone who actually cared about the music? Before he could talk himself out of it, David sat down on the bench. It was the perfect height, padded and comfortable, nothing like the wobbly plastic chair he used at home. He placed his hands over the keys, not touching them yet, just hovering, feeling the potential beneath his fingertips. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. This was crazy. He shouldn't be here. He was going to get in trouble. He should stand up right now and walk away before anyone noticed him. But his hands were already moving toward the keys, and he couldn't stop them even if he wanted to. For 3 years he'd dreamed of playing a real piano. Just once. Just to know what it felt like. His index finger pressed down on middle C, and the sound that came out was so pure, so perfect, that tears sprang to David's eyes. It wasn't like his keyboard at all. This note sang. It filled the space around him rich and full and alive. He pressed another key, then another. The sound was incredible, each note clear and true, resonating in a way that made his whole body feel warm despite his wet clothes. David closed his eyes and let his hands find the melody he'd been practicing for months. It was Chopin, one of the videos he'd watched maybe 100 times, learning it piece by piece on his broken keyboard where half the notes didn't even play. But here, on this piano, every single note was perfect. He was so lost in the music, in the feeling of those smooth keys beneath his fingers and that pure, beautiful sound filling the air, that he didn't notice the lobby had gone quiet. He didn't see the guests turning to look. He didn't hear the footsteps approaching. He was just beginning the second phrase of the piece, his fingers moving across the keys with growing confidence, when a sharp voice cut through the music like a knife. "Excuse me? What do you think you're doing?" David's hands froze on the keys. The last note hung in the air for a moment before fading away. His eyes snapped open and his stomach dropped. A tall man in an expensive suit was striding toward him, his face red with anger. Behind him, David could see all the guests staring. Some looked annoyed. Others looked disgusted. A few were whispering to each other, their eyes fixed on his wet, ragged clothes and his worn-out shoes. David tried to stand up, but his legs felt like jelly. The man was almost to the piano now, and the expression on his face made David want to disappear into the floor. He'd made a terrible mistake. And now he was going to pay for it. The man's hand clamped down on David's shoulder, fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. David flinched, his whole body going rigid with fear. He'd never been grabbed like this before, and the shame of it burned through him like fire. "I asked you a question," the man said, his voice loud enough that everyone in the lobby could hear. "What do you think you're doing touching this piano?" David's mouth opened, but no words came out. His throat felt tight like someone was squeezing it. He tried to apologize, tried to say he was sorry, but all that came out was a small, choked sound. The man looked him up and down with obvious disgust, taking in the dripping jacket, the shoes with holes, the puddle of water forming on the floor beneath the bench. His lip curled. "This piano is for hotel guests only," he announced, speaking to the entire lobby now as if David were some kind of exhibit. "It's a $200,000 instrument. Not a toy for street children to put their dirty hands on." David felt his face go hot. Street children. The words hit him like a slap. He wasn't homeless. He had a home. It was small and the heat didn't always work and sometimes there were roaches, but it was home. His mother worked 16-hour days to keep that home. They weren't street people. But looking down at himself, at his clothes and his broken shoes, David could see why the man thought that. He looked like he didn't belong anywhere, let alone in a place like this. "I'm sorry," David finally managed to whisper. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just what?" The man interrupted. "Just thinking you could waltz in here and touch whatever you wanted? This is private property, young man. This hotel serves a very exclusive clientele, and we can't have just anyone coming in off the streets." Some of the guests were nodding now, murmuring their agreement. An older woman with gray hair piled high on her head leaned over to her companion and said, loud enough for David to hear, "It's gotten so bad lately. They really should have better security." Another man in a business suit shook his head. "Can you imagine? Letting someone like that touch a Steinway? He probably doesn't even know what it is. Could have damaged it." David wanted to tell them that he did know what it was, that he'd researched pianos online, that he knew Steinway was one of the best brands in the world, that he understood how valuable this instrument was. That's why he'd been so careful. That's why his hands had been shaking, but he didn't say any of that. He just stood there, frozen, as the man's grip on his shoulder tightened. "Do you have any idea how much that piano costs?" The man continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "One scratch, one mark from your wet clothes, and it would cost thousands to repair. Thousands of dollars. More money than you've probably seen in your entire life." David's eyes were burning now, tears threatening to spill over. He blinked hard, trying to keep them back. He wouldn't cry, not here. Not in front of all these people who were looking at him like he was garbage. I was careful, David said quietly, his voice barely audible. I didn't hurt it. I promise, the man laughed, but there was no humor in it. Careful? You're dripping water all over it right now. Look at the floor. Look at the bench where you were sitting. David looked down and saw that the man was right. There were wet spots on the piano bench, droplets on the floor around the piano. He hadn't even thought about that. He'd been so focused on the music, so lost in the moment, that he hadn't considered the water dripping from his clothes. A new wave of shame washed over him. Maybe they were right. Maybe he really had been careless. Maybe he really didn't belong here. I'm calling security, the man said, pulling out his phone. We need to escort this boy out before he damages anything else, and I'll need to file a report about this incident. David's stomach dropped. Security. A report. Would they call the police? Would they call his mother at work? She couldn't leave the laundromat, not in the middle of a double shift. She'd lose her job. They couldn't afford that, please, David said, his voice cracking. Please don't call anyone. I'll leave right now. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. He tried to step away from the piano, but the man's hand was still on his shoulder, holding him in place like he was some kind of criminal. More guests were gathering now, forming a small crowd around the piano. A young woman in an expensive-looking dress wrinkled her nose as she looked at David. An elderly couple stood arm in arm, shaking their heads in disapproval. A businessman in a three-piece suit took out his phone and appeared to be taking a picture, probably to show his friends later. Look at this kid who tried to play the hotel piano. David had never felt so small in his entire life. So worthless, so completely out of place. This is exactly what's wrong these days, someone in the crowd muttered. No respect. No boundaries. Everyone thinks they're entitled to everything. Someone should teach these kids some manners, another voice added. The man with his hand on David's shoulder nodded in agreement. I completely understand. This hotel has a reputation to maintain. We can't have just anyone wandering in and, wait, the single word cut through the noise like a bell ringing. Everyone turned to look. An old man was sitting in a wheelchair near the large windows that overlooked the street. David hadn't noticed him before. The man looked to be in his 80s with white hair and weathered hands resting on the arms of his chair. He wore a suit that probably cost more than David's entire apartment, but there was something different about him. Something in his eyes that wasn't cold or judgmental. The man who'd been gripping David's shoulder immediately let go and straightened up. Mr. Steinfeld, he said quickly, his voice suddenly nervous. I apologize for the disturbance. I was just handling this situation. The old man in the wheelchair didn't look at him. He was looking directly at David, studying him with an intensity that made David want to look away. But he didn't. Something about those eyes held him in place. The boy was playing, the old man said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir, but he's not a guest here, and the piano is not for... I know what the piano is for, Thomas, the old man interrupted quietly. I donated it to this hotel 15 years ago. I believe that gives me some say in who plays it. The crowd went silent. Even Thomas, the man who'd been so angry a moment ago, seemed to deflate a little. The old man wheeled himself closer to the piano, his chair making soft sounds on the marble floor. When he was a few feet away from David, he stopped and looked up at him. You came here in the rain just to play this piano? He asked. David nodded, not trusting his voice. Why? It was a simple question, but David didn't have a simple answer. How could he explain the hunger that had been building inside him for 3 years? The need to touch a real piano, to hear what music was supposed to sound like when it wasn't coming from broken keys and a failing speaker. I wanted to know, David finally said, his voice small but steady. I wanted to know what it felt like, to play something real. The old man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He turned to look at Thomas, at the crowd of guests, at all the people who had been so quick to judge. Let the boy play, he said. Thomas's face went pale. Mr. Steinfeld, I really don't think that's appropriate. Given his condition and the state of his clothing, I think it would be better if... 2 minutes, the old man said, his voice firm despite his age. We can surely spare 2 minutes to let this young man play. After all, he came all this way. There was something in his tone that made it clear this wasn't a request. It was a command. Thomas opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. He stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest, his face tight with disapproval. The crowd didn't move. If anything, more people had gathered now, curious to see what would happen. David could feel all their eyes on him, judging him, waiting for him to fail. His hands were shaking harder now. 2 minutes. The old man had given him 2 minutes, but what if he messed up? What if his fingers slipped, or he forgot the notes, or it sounded terrible? These people already thought he was worthless. If he played badly, it would only prove them right. "Whenever you're ready," the old man said gently. David looked down at the piano keys. They were still beautiful, still perfect, still waiting. He thought about his broken keyboard at home, about all those hours he'd spent learning, practicing, playing the same pieces over and over until his fingers ached. He thought about his mother, working herself to exhaustion at the laundromat. She'd never heard him play. Not really. Their apartment was too small for a keyboard, so he practiced at the community center when they let him. She'd never know what happened here today unless he told her, but he would know. He would always know whether he ran away or whether he played. David sat back down on the bench. He could hear someone in the crowd snicker. Could hear Thomas mutter something under his breath about this being a waste of time. He placed his hands over the keys just like before. They were still shaking, but less now. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then David began to play. The first note rang out clear and perfect, filling every corner of the massive lobby. David's right hand moved to the next note, then the next, building the opening melody of Chopin's ballad. His left hand joined in, adding the deep bass notes that gave the piece its foundation. For the first few seconds, the crowd remained skeptical. David could feel their doubt hanging in the air like smoke. They were waiting for him to mess up, to prove that he was exactly what they thought he was, just a poor kid who didn't know any better. But then something shifted. The melody began to flow, each note connecting to the next with a smoothness that came from hundreds of hours of practice. David's fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence, finding each note exactly where it needed to be. The piece started soft and delicate, like a whisper, and David played it that way, coaxing the gentlest possible sound from the massive instrument. Behind him, he heard someone's teacup clink against a saucer as they set it down. The whispered conversations had stopped. David kept playing. His eyes still closed, his whole world narrowed down to the music and the feeling of those perfect keys beneath his fingers. This was nothing like his keyboard at home. Every note responded exactly the way he wanted it to. When he pressed hard, the sound soared. When he touched the keys gently, they sang softly. The piano wasn't fighting him. It was working with him like they were speaking the same language. The piece began to build now, growing more complex. David's hands moved faster, crossing over each other, his fingers stretching to reach the wider intervals. This was the part he'd struggled with the most on his broken keyboard, where some of the keys stuck and others didn't play at all. He'd had to imagine what those missing notes would sound like, had to fill in the gaps in his mind. But here, every single note was there. Every single note was perfect. The music swelled, growing louder and more powerful. David's whole body moved with it, swaying slightly on the bench as his hands raced across the keys. He hit a series of thundering chords in the bass, and the sound was so rich, so full, that he felt it vibrate through his chest. Somewhere in the crowd, someone gasped. David didn't hear it. He was too lost in the music now, too far gone to think about the people watching or the judgment in their eyes. All those hours on his broken keyboard, all those nights when his fingers ached and his back hurt from sitting on that wobbly chair. All those times he'd watched the same tutorial video over and over on his cracked phone screen because he couldn't afford lessons. It was all worth it for this moment, this one perfect moment. The piece shifted again, the melody becoming softer, more melancholic. This was David's favorite part, the section that always made him feel things he didn't have words for. Sadness, but not quite. Longing for something he couldn't name. Hope mixed with heartbreak. His touch on the keys became lighter, more delicate. Each note needed to sing on its own, to tell its own small part of the story. David had practiced this section more than any other, trying to get the feeling right, trying to make it sound the way it did in the recordings he'd listened to late at night when he couldn't sleep. And now, on this incredible piano, it was finally happening. The notes floated out into the lobby like birds taking flight, each one clear and pure and exactly right. David's eyes were still closed, but if they'd been open, he would have seen that the entire lobby had gone completely still. The woman with the expensive dress had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. The businessman who'd taken a picture earlier had lowered his phone, forgotten. The elderly couple stood frozen, their faces showing something that looked like shock. Even Thomas, the hotel manager who'd been so angry, had uncrossed his arms. His mouth was slightly open, and his eyebrows had drawn together in an expression that might have been confusion or might have been something else entirely. The old man in the wheelchair sat perfectly still, but tears were running down his weathered cheeks. The music built toward its climax now, the gentle melody giving way to passionate, powerful chords. David's hands flew across the keys, hitting notes in rapid succession, building the tension higher and higher. This was the hardest part of the entire piece, the section that required the most technical skill and the most emotion all at once. His fingers were starting to ache, but he didn't slow down. Sweat had broken out on his forehead despite the cool air in the lobby. His wet clothes had started to dry, leaving dark stains on his jacket, but he didn't notice. Nothing existed except the music and the piano and the feeling of being completely, perfectly alive. The piece reached its peak, massive chords crashing down like waves against rocks. David put everything he had into those notes, all the frustration of being poor, all the loneliness of coming home to an empty apartment, all the exhaustion he saw in his mother's eyes every night, all the hunger he felt for something more, something better, something beautiful in a world that often felt hard and gray. It all poured out through his fingers and into the piano, and the piano took it all and made it into something magnificent. Then, just as quickly as it had built up, the music began to soften again. The storm passed, leaving behind something quieter, something sadder, but also somehow peaceful. David's hands slowed, playing the final phrases with a tenderness that made the notes seem fragile, like they might break if he pressed too hard. The last section was almost a whisper, a gentle reminder of the melody that had started the piece. David played it like he was saying goodbye to something precious, his fingers barely touching the keys, coaxing out the softest possible sound, and then it was over. The final note hung in the air for a long moment, resonating through the lobby, slowly fading until it was gone completely. David's hands remained on the keys for a few seconds after the sound had died away. His head bowed, his breath coming fast. The silence that followed was absolute. David finally opened his eyes. His hands were trembling as he lifted them from the keys. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. He'd played the entire piece start to finish without making a single major mistake. On a real piano, a perfect piano. Slowly, almost afraid of what he'd see, David turned around to face the crowd. Every single person in the lobby was staring at him. But their faces were different now. The disgust was gone. The judgment had vanished. Instead, they looked stunned, amazed. Some of them looked like they couldn't quite believe what they'd just heard. The silence stretched on for another heartbeat. Then another. Then someone started clapping. It was the old man in the wheelchair, his weathered hands coming together in steady, deliberate applause. The sound echoed through the quiet lobby like gunshots. For a moment, no one else moved. They just stared at the old man, then at David, then back at the old man again. Then the woman in the expensive dress began clapping too. Then the businessman, then the elderly couple, then everyone, all at once, the entire lobby erupting into applause. The sound was overwhelming. People weren't just clapping politely. They were applauding like David had just performed in a concert hall. Some of them were on their feet. The woman with the gray hair piled high had tears streaming down her face. The businessman was shaking his head in disbelief, but he was smiling. Even Thomas looked shocked, his face pale, his hands frozen at his sides like he couldn't quite process what had just happened. David sat on the piano bench, completely overwhelmed. He'd expected to be thrown out. He'd expected more humiliation, more judgment, more shame. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected any of this. The old man in the wheelchair rolled himself closer to the piano, his hands still applauding slowly. When he was right in front of David, he stopped clapping and just looked at the boy with an expression that David couldn't quite read. "Extraordinary," the old man said, his voice quiet but somehow carrying through the noise of the continuing applause. "Simply extraordinary." He studied David's face for a long moment, his eyes sharp despite his age. Then he raised his hand and gradually the applause began to die down. People fell silent, sensing that the old man had something more to say. When the lobby was quiet again, the old man spoke, his voice steady and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the entire crowd, "allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is Robert Steinfeld. I am the founder and director of the Steinfeld Academy of Music. For the past 60 years, I have dedicated my life to identifying and nurturing the finest musical talent in this country." He paused, letting that sink in. Several people in the crowd gasped. The Steinfeld Academy was famous. David had read about it online. It was one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Students who graduated from there went on to perform in the greatest concert halls, to record albums, to become the musicians that other musicians looked up to. The old man turned back to David, his expression serious. "Young man," he said, "I have heard hundreds, perhaps thousands, of pianists in my lifetime. I have taught prodigies and geniuses. I have sat in judgment on some of the most talented musicians of our generation." David's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. "What I just heard," the old man continued, his voice growing softer, "was one of the most moving performances I have experienced in years. And I would very much like to know where you learned to play like that." David's mouth had gone completely dry. Robert Steinfeld. The Robert Steinfeld. The man who had trained concert pianists who performed at Carnegie Hall and the Sydney Opera House. The man whose students won international competitions and got recording contracts with major labels. That Robert Steinfeld was sitting right in front of him, asking where he'd learned to play. David started, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I taught myself." The old man's eyebrows rose slightly. "Taught yourself," he repeated as if testing the words. "And where did you study? Which books did you use? Who guided your technique?" David felt his face grow hot again, but this time it wasn't from shame. It was from the absurdity of trying to explain his situation to someone like Robert Steinfeld. Someone who had spent his entire life in the world of professional music, of proper training and expensive schools. "I found a keyboard," David said slowly, "in a dumpster behind the electronics store on 5th Street. It was broken. Only about half the keys worked and the sound cut in and out. But it was free, so I took it." He could see several people in the crowd exchanging glances. The woman in the expensive dress looked like she might cry. "I watched videos online," David continued, "on my phone. Tutorial videos mostly, some concert recordings when I could find them. I'd watch the same video maybe 50 or 100 times, trying to see exactly where the fingers went, exactly how they moved." Robert Steinfeld leaned forward in his wheelchair, his hands gripping the armrests. "How long have you been teaching yourself this way?" 3 years, David said. "Since I was 9. 3 years, the old man repeated softly. He turned to look at the crowd, at all the well-dressed people who had been so quick to judge. "This young man has been teaching himself piano for 3 years on a broken keyboard, using free videos on a phone, with no teacher, no guidance, no formal instruction of any kind. And he just played Chopin's Ballad No. 1 with more feeling and technical proficiency than students I've seen who have had 10 years of expensive private lessons." The lobby was silent again. Thomas, the hotel manager, looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. His face had gone from pale to red and he was staring at his shoes. "What's your name, son?" Robert Steinfeld asked, turning back to David. "David Chen, sir." "Well, David Chen, I have another question for you. Why this piece? Chopin's Ballad is not easy. It's not what most self-taught pianists would choose. Why did you pick it?" David thought about that for a moment. He'd never really put it into words before, why that particular piece had called to him. "It felt true," he finally said, like it was saying something real. Something about how life can be beautiful and sad at the same time. How you can want something so badly it hurts, but you know you might never get it. That's what the music felt like to me, like it understood. Something changed in the old man's expression. His eyes grew softer, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentle. "Where do you live, David?" "Above the Chinese restaurant on Maple Street." "With my mom."
She works at the laundromat on the corner.
"And your father?" "He left when I was 5. It's just me and my mom now." Robert Steinfeld nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He was quiet for a moment, just looking at David with those sharp, knowing eyes. Then he turned his wheelchair to face the crowd. "I want everyone here to understand something," he said, his voice carrying through the lobby. "What you just witnessed is what we in the music world call raw talent. Pure, undeniable, extraordinary talent. This young man has had none of the advantages that most of my students take for granted. No grand piano in his living room. No weekly lessons with qualified teachers. No music theory classes or recitals or competitions. He learned from a broken keyboard and a phone screen. And yet he plays with a maturity and emotional depth that many professionals spend their entire lives trying to achieve. He paused, letting his words sink in. Talent like this doesn't come along often, he continued. In 60 years of teaching, I have seen it perhaps a dozen times. And every single time it demands to be nurtured. It demands to be given a chance. David's heart was beating so fast now that he felt dizzy. He didn't dare hope. Didn't dare even think about what the old man might be suggesting. Robert Steinfeld turned back to David. I would like to offer you a full scholarship to the Steinfeld Academy, he said simply. Tuition, room, board, everything. You would live on campus during the school year. You would study piano with our best instructors. You would learn music theory, composition, performance technique, everything you need to develop your gift properly. David couldn't breathe. A full scholarship. To the Steinfeld Academy. It was impossible. Things like this didn't happen to kids like him. I can't, David heard himself say and immediately wanted to take it back. But it was true. My mom, she needs me. I help her with things. And she can't afford for me to go away somewhere. We barely make rent as it is. The scholarship includes a living stipend for your mother, Robert Steinfeld said. $5,000 a month, to help make up for your absence and to ensure she's taken care of while you're studying. It's not much, but it should help. $5,000 a month. David's mother made about $2,000 a month at the laundromat, working herself into exhaustion. $5,000 would mean she could cut back her hours, maybe even take a day off once in a while, maybe stop looking so tired all the time. I don't understand, David said, his voice shaking. Why would you do this? You don't even know me. The old man smiled, and it was the first time David had seen him smile. It made him look younger somehow, less severe. I was you once, he said quietly. A long time ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I grew up poor. My father worked in a factory. My mother took in laundry. We lived in a 2-room apartment in a bad part of town. But I could play piano, and someone saw that. Someone gave me a chance when no one else would. That chance changed my entire life. He reached out and put his weathered hand on David's shoulder. But unlike Thomas's grip earlier, this touch was gentle, kind. I've spent 60 years trying to pay forward the gift someone gave me, Robert Steinfeld said. I've trained hundreds of students, and I've loved every moment of it. But you, David Chen, you remind me why I started doing this in the first place. You remind me what music is really about. It's not about money or prestige or fancy concert halls. It's about this. He tapped his chest over his heart. It's about what's in here trying to get out. And you have something in there worth sharing with the world. David felt tears burning in his eyes, and this time he didn't try to hold them back. They spilled down his cheeks, and he didn't care who saw. I don't know what to say, he whispered. Say yes, the old man replied. Say you'll take this chance. Say you'll let me help you become everything you're capable of becoming. David looked around the lobby, at all the people who had judged him so harshly just minutes ago. They were watching him now with completely different expressions. The woman in the expensive dress was dabbing at her eyes with the tissue. The businessman was nodding encouragingly. Even Thomas looked like he might be feeling something close to regret. There's just one condition, Robert Steinfeld said. David's stomach dropped. Of course there was a condition. There was always a catch. You have to promise me something, the old man continued. Someday, when you've made it, when you're everything I know you can be, you'll do the same thing for someone else. You'll find a young person with talent who needs a chance, and you'll give it to them. You'll pay it forward, just like I'm doing for you, just like someone did for me. Can you promise me that? David didn't even have to think about it. Yes, he said. Yes, I promise, Robert Steinfeld smiled again, wider this time. Then we have an agreement. He held out his hand. David shook it, his small hand disappearing inside the old man's grip. The old man's skin was papery and thin, but his handshake was firm and strong. The lobby erupted into applause again, even louder than before. People were cheering now, calling out congratulations. The woman in the expensive dress rushed forward. I'm so sorry, she said to David, her voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry for judging you, for thinking terrible things. You're remarkable. Truly remarkable. Others came forward too, apologizing, congratulating, asking questions. The businessman wanted to know if David had any recordings. The elderly couple said they'd be looking for his name in concert programs in a few years. Even Thomas approached, though he couldn't quite meet David's eyes. "I apologize for my behavior," he said stiffly. "It was inappropriate. I should have been more understanding." David wanted to be angry at him, wanted to throw his apology back in his face. But looking at Thomas's uncomfortable expression, he found he couldn't hold on to the anger. Thomas had been wrong, but he'd also been doing what he thought was his job. He'd made a mistake, but he was owning up to it. "It's okay," David said. "I probably shouldn't have just sat down and started playing without asking." "No," Robert Steinfeld interjected firmly. "You had every right to play. Music belongs to everyone, not just to those who can afford it. Thomas, I trust this incident will serve as a reminder that we should never judge people by their appearance or their circumstances." Thomas nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." "Absolutely, sir." Robert Steinfeld pulled out a business card from his jacket pocket and handed it to David. "My office number is on there. Have your mother call me tomorrow morning. We'll arrange everything. The fall semester starts in 3 weeks, which doesn't give us much time, but we'll make it work." 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, David's entire life would change. He'd go from living above a Chinese restaurant with a broken keyboard to studying at one of the best music schools in the world. It didn't seem real. It didn't seem possible, but the card in his hand was real. The old man in front of him was real. This was actually happening. "Thank you," David said, and his voice broke on the words. "Thank you so much. I don't know how to thank you enough." "Play," Robert Steinfeld said simply. "Keep playing. That's all the thanks I need." David ran all the way to the laundromat. The rain had stopped and the evening sun was breaking through the clouds, making the wet streets shimmer. His broken shoes splashed through puddles, but he didn't care. His heart felt like it might explode from his chest. He had to tell his mother. He had to tell her right now. The laundromat smelled like detergent and warm fabric, just like it always did. His mother was at the folding table, her hands moving automatically as she folded a mountain of white towels. Her shoulders were hunched with exhaustion, and strands of gray hair had escaped from her ponytail. She looked so tired. She always looked so tired. "Mom." David burst through the door, breathless. She looked up, concern flooding her face immediately. "David, what's wrong? Why are you soaking wet?" "Nothing's wrong," he said, gasping for air. "Mom, something incredible just happened. Something impossible." Over the next 20 minutes, while his mother listened with growing amazement, David told her everything. The hotel, the piano, the humiliation, the old man in the wheelchair, the performance, the scholarship. All of it tumbled out in a rush of words and emotion. When he finished, his mother just stood there with a half-folded towel in her hands, staring at him like he'd just told her he could fly. "The Steinfeld Academy?" she whispered. "David, that's one of the best music schools in the world." "I know," he said, pulling out the business card with trembling hands. "He said you should call tomorrow. He said there's a stipend, $5,000 a month, Mom. That's more than double what you make now. You could work less. You could rest." His mother's eyes filled with tears. She set down the towel and pulled David into a hug so tight he could barely breathe. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered against his hair. "So incredibly proud. But David, are you sure? The academy is 2 hours away. You'd have to live there. I wouldn't see you except on holidays and summer break." David pulled back to look at her face. "Are you saying I shouldn't go?" "No," she said quickly, wiping her eyes. "No, of course not. This is your dream. This is everything you've ever wanted. I'm just saying, I'll miss you so much." "I'll miss you too," David said, and he meant it. The idea of not seeing his mother every day made his chest ache. But the idea of not taking this chance made it ache even worse. "But Mom, this could change everything. For both of us." She nodded, cupping his face in her work-worn hands. "I know, baby, I know. We'll make it work. We'll figure it out together." The next morning, his mother called the number on the card. By afternoon, everything was arranged. Robert Steinfeld's assistant would handle all the paperwork. A car would come to pick up David in 3 weeks. They'd take him shopping for clothes and supplies before the semester started. Everything was covered. Everything was taken care of. Those 3 weeks passed in a blur. David practiced on his broken keyboard every chance he got. wanting to be ready, wanting to be worthy of this incredible gift he'd been given. His mother worked extra shifts to save a little money, even though David told her she didn't have to. She wanted him to have spending money, she said, just in case. The day he left was harder than David had expected. His mother stood on the sidewalk in front of their building, trying not to cry as the black car waited at the curb. The driver had already loaded David's single battered suitcase into the trunk. "You call me every Sunday," she said, straightening his new shirt collar for the third time. "And if you need anything at all, you tell me right away." "I will, Mom, I promise. And eat properly. Don't just live on cafeteria food. Make sure you get vegetables." "Mom," David said, half laughing, half crying. "I'll be fine." She pulled him into one last hug. "I love you so much," she whispered. "You go show them what you're made of." The first semester at the Steinfeld Academy was the hardest thing David had ever done. The other students had been playing piano since they were 4 or 5 years old. They could sight-read music David had never even seen before. They knew about composers and techniques and theories that were completely foreign to him, but David had something they didn't. He had hunger. He had the memory of that moment in the hotel lobby, when everyone had looked at him like he was nothing and then looked at him like he was everything. He had years of teaching himself, of figuring things out on his own, of not giving up even when it seemed impossible. He practiced 6 hours a day, sometimes more. His fingers developed calluses. His back ached. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Robert Steinfeld became more than just the director of the academy. He became David's mentor, his guide, the father figure David had never really had. Once a week, David would have a private lesson in Mr. Steinfeld's office, and they'd talk about music and life and everything in between. "You have something special," Mr. Steinfeld told him during one of these sessions. "Technical skill can be taught. But that thing inside you, that ability to make people feel something when you play, that can't be taught. That's a gift. Don't ever lose it." David thought about that often in the years that followed. As he progressed through the academy, as he won competitions and earned praise from teachers, he tried to remember what Mr. Steinfeld had said. It wasn't about showing off or proving he was better than anyone else. It was about the music. It was about making people feel something true. His mother came to every recital, every performance, no matter how far she had to travel. She'd sit in the audience in her best dress, the one she saved for special occasions, and she'd cry every single time he played. Afterward, she'd hug him and tell him how proud she was, and David would remember why he was doing all of this. 4 years passed. Then 5. David graduated at the top of his class. Offers came pouring in from orchestras, performance venues, recording studios. But before David accepted any of them, he had something he needed to do. He went back to the Grandview Hotel on a Tuesday afternoon, just like that first day. But this time he wasn't running from the rain. This time he walked through the front doors with his head held high, wearing a good suit, carrying an invitation. Thomas, the hotel manager, recognized him immediately. His face went pale, probably remembering that awful day 5 years ago. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice uncertain. "It's good to see you again." "It's good to see you too, Thomas," David said, and he meant it. That day had been humiliating, yes, but it had also changed his life. If Thomas hadn't made such a scene, if he hadn't called security, Mr. Steinfeld might never have intervened. In a strange way, Thomas had been part of the miracle. "I'm having a concert at the Symphony Hall next month," David said, holding out the invitation. "I'd like you to come. Front row seats. My gift to you." Thomas took the invitation with shaking hands. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly. "After how I treated you." "Everyone deserves a second chance," David said. "Someone gave me one. I'm just paying it forward." The piano was still there in the lobby, gleaming beneath the chandelier. David walked over to it and ran his hand along its smooth surface, remembering. "Would you like to play?" Thomas asked hesitantly. David smiled. "Maybe just for a moment." He sat down at the bench, the same bench where he'd sat 5 years ago, terrified and ashamed and filled with desperate hope. He placed his hands on the keys, and this time they didn't shake at all. He played the opening bars of Chopin's Ballade, the same piece that had changed everything. A few hotel guests looked up from their afternoon tea, and slowly a small crowd began to gather just like before. But this time, when they looked at David, they saw something different. They saw a young man who'd made it, who'd taken an impossible chance and turned it into something real. They saw proof that talent and determination could overcome anything, even poverty, even judgment, even a world that said people like him didn't belong in places like this. When David finished playing, the applause was warm and genuine. He stood up and thanked them with a small bow. As he walked back across the lobby toward the exit, he saw a young girl standing near the windows. She was maybe 10 years old, wearing clothes that had seen better days, and she was staring at the piano with an expression David recognized immediately: hunger, hope, longing. David walked over to her and knelt down so they were at eye level. "Do you play?" he asked gently. The girl nodded shyly. "A little. I'm teaching myself from videos," David smiled. Of course she was. He pulled out one of his business cards and handed it to her. "I run a music program for kids who want to learn but can't afford lessons," he said. "It's completely free. If you're interested, have your parents call this number. We'll get you set up with a real piano and a real teacher." The girl's eyes went wide. "Really? For free?" "Really," David said. "Everyone deserves a chance to make music." As he left the hotel and stepped out into the sunshine, David thought about Mr. Steinfeld. The old man had passed away 2 years ago, peacefully in his sleep. But before he died, he'd made David promise one more time to pay forward the gift he'd been given. David had kept that promise. He'd started the music program. He'd found other kids like him, kids with talent and hunger but no opportunities. He'd given them what Mr. Steinfeld had given him, a chance. And every time David sat down at a piano, every time he played, he thought about that rainy afternoon when his whole life had changed. When he'd been humiliated and then lifted up. When he'd learned that the world could be cruel, but it could also be kind. That people could judge you, but they could also change their minds. That sometimes all you needed was one person to believe in you, and everything became possible. David Chen had started as a poor boy with a broken keyboard and a dream. He'd become a concert pianist, a teacher, a mentor to dozens of young musicians. But more than that, he'd become living proof that talent doesn't care about money or status or where you come from. It only cares about the music and the courage to play.